Why has the voice of women so often been silenced in the story of Christianity? Why, in a faith that began with Mary Magdalene as a witness to the resurrection, did women quickly lose their place of authority? Could it be that the exclusion of women from power was not natural nor divine, but deliberate, carefully constructed, with texts hidden, rewritten, or buried to keep them away from influence? Elaine, one of the most respected scholars of Gnosticism and early Christianity, uncovered evidence that points directly to this possibility. In her groundbreaking studies of the Nag Hammadi texts and other suppressed writings, she revealed how alternative Christian communities gave women equal authority, seeing them as carriers of divine wisdom and even as leaders of spiritual assemblies. These ideas, however, were dangerous to the emerging hierarchy of the institutional church, which depended on male dominance to preserve its structure of control. So the question arises, what truths had to be buried to erase women from the highest roles of Christianity? What revelations were branded as heresy, not because they were false, but because they were too empowering? And how would the faith look today if those voices had not been silenced? In this video, we will follow Elaine Pagels as she brings to light the forgotten stories of women in early Christianity, exploring the hidden texts that portray them not as passive followers, but as visionaries, teachers, and even as reflections of the divine feminine. By the end, you may never see the history of the church or the place of women within it the same way again. If you feel drawn to uncover truths that were long concealed, subscribe to this channel. By joining, you step into a community of seekers who believe that hidden knowledge still has the power to transform us today. Because only when we recover the forgotten voices can the story of faith finally be told in full. Elaine Pagels began her journey with a question that seems simple but carries enormous weight. Why were so many early Christian writings left out of the Bible? When the Nag Hammadi library was discovered in Egypt in 1945, dozens of hidden gospels and mystical texts came to light. Among them were writings that spoke of Mary Magdalene as a disciple with secret knowledge, of women who taught alongside men, and of a divine feminine presence that balanced the masculine. These texts offered a very different picture from the one that survived in the official canon. Doesn't that make you wonder who decided which voices would remain and which would be silenced? The problem, Pagels explained, is that the early Christian movement was not unified. In the first centuries, there were many competing interpretations of Jesus' message. Some groups followed a more mystical path, like the Gnostics, who saw salvation not through rigid authority, but through personal knowledge of the divine. In these circles, women often played central roles. Texts such as the Gospel of Mary describe a woman who understands Christ's message more deeply than the male disciples, who resist her authority out of jealousy and fear. Imagine how threatening this story would be to those building a church hierarchy based on male leadership. Pagels pointed out that when bishops like Irenaeus in the 2nd century fought against heresy, they were not just defending doctrine, they were protecting a structure of power. To admit the authority of texts that honored Mary Magdalene or Sophia, the divine wisdom, would have undermined the exclusivity of male control. So the solution was simple but brutal. Declare these writings heretical, destroy them where possible, and shape the canon to reflect only the voices that supported their authority. The result was a Christianity where women were pushed to the margins, not by divine will, but by political choice. Think about it. If the Gospel of Mary had been part of the New Testament, would the history of women in Christianity have been completely different? And if so, what does that tell us about how much of the story we've been given is truly complete? The Gnostic texts reveal symbols and ideas that completely transform the way we see women's role in spirituality. Elaine Pagels showed how many of these writings presented a vision of the divine that was not exclusively masculine. In works like the Apocryphon of John or the Thunder Perfect Mind, the divine speaks in both male and female voices, embodying fullness rather than exclusion. For the Gnostics, God could not be limited to one gender. The divine was balance, containing both masculine and feminine. Doesn't this make you question why, for centuries, official Christianity erased this balance and presented only the image of a male god? One of the most striking figures in these hidden writings is Sophia, whose name means wisdom. Sophia was not portrayed as secondary or weak. She was the cosmic power whose fall and redemption mirrored the human journey. Some Gnostics saw Sophia as the key to salvation, the feminine principle guiding souls back to the light. If this symbol had remained central in Christianity, perhaps women would have been seen as reflections of Sophia, carriers of divine wisdom themselves. Instead, these stories were suppressed, and Sophia's role was nearly erased from Christian teaching. Pagels explained that these symbols were more than poetry. They were revolutionary. By recognizing the divine feminine, the early mystical Christians created space for women to act as teachers, prophets, and leaders. In gatherings, a woman could speak with the same authority as a man, because she too carried the spark of God. The Acts of Paul and Thecla, for example, tell the story of a woman who preached boldly, defied social norms, and was celebrated for her faith. How different is this from the later church, where women were told to remain silent? It is here that we see the heart of the problem. Symbols shape power. If God can be imagined as both male and female, then men and women alike have a place in leadership. But if God is imagined only as male, then authority naturally falls into the hands of men. By erasing the feminine from the sacred, the church could reinforce a system that excluded half of humanity from power. Elaine Pagels makes it clear that the exclusion of women from Christian power was not a silent accident, but a deliberate act of distortion. As the institutional church gained strength in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, leaders like Tertullian and Irenaeus openly attacked texts that gave women authority. Tertullian went so far as to ridicule women who preached, writing that it was outrageous for them to teach or baptize. But why would he feel the need to attack unless women were already doing these things in Christian communities? Doesn't this reveal that women once held far more influence than history books usually admit? The distortion extended to the way stories were told. In the Gospel of Mary, when she shares her vision of Christ's teaching, Peter challenges her, asking why Jesus would reveal such secrets to a woman instead of to them. The text shows a conflict between those who recognized her authority and those who rejected it out of pride. This narrative mirrors what was happening in real Christian communities. Men struggling to secure dominance by denying the legitimacy of women's voices. Over time, the voices of Peter's side became the official ones, while the voices of Mary and others like her were silenced. Pagels explained that this was not just about gender, but about control. If salvation came through personal knowledge of the divine, as the Gnostics taught, then the church's authority was weakened. But if salvation could be controlled through male bishops, priests, and rituals, then the institution gained power. Silencing women was part of silencing any alternative path to God. Have you ever wondered how different Christianity would feel today if the teachings of Mary and Sophia had been preserved alongside those of Peter and Paul? By burying texts and branding them heresy, the church constructed a version of Christianity that served its structure of power. And once that version became dominant, centuries of believers inherited it as unquestionable truth. But thanks to discoveries like Nag Hammadi, we now know that another story existed, a story where women carried authority, wisdom, and spiritual power equal to men. The turning point in Elaine Pagels' work comes when she highlights how the suppressed revelations change everything we thought we knew about Christianity's beginnings. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi library showed us that the Christian world was never uniform. It was diverse, full of competing visions. In some communities, women were prophets, healers, and teachers. They were not excluded, but celebrated. The Gospel of Thomas even preserves a mysterious saying where Jesus speaks of transforming Mary into a living spirit equal to the men, a phrase that challenges the rigid gender roles later imposed. Doesn't that suggest that early Christianity was far more radical and inclusive than the version handed down to us? Pagels emphasized that these hidden Gospels did not deny Christ. They deepened his message. Instead of obedience to authority, they emphasized awakening, inner transformation, and equality of the divine spark. In this light, Mary Magdalene was not just a follower who stood in the background. She was a knower, a bearer of wisdom equal to any of the apostles. For the Gnostics, this was not scandalous but natural, because truth could be revealed to anyone, regardless of gender. But here lies the great shift. As Christianity became tied to empire first tolerated, then promoted by Roman power, the version that favored hierarchy and male authority was the one chosen. A church aligned with empire could not afford a vision where women stood equal, nor one where individuals claimed authority from personal experience with God. The Gnostic and mystical voices, especially those that empowered women, had to be silenced. Pagels asked us to imagine, what if those texts had not been buried? What if they had shaped the canon alongside the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? Perhaps women would not have been locked out of priesthood for centuries. Perhaps the balance of masculine and feminine would have remained alive in Christian imagination. And perhaps the faith itself would have evolved into something far less rigid, more mystical, and more inclusive. These possibilities remind us that history is never neutral. It is written by those in power. And the erasure of women's voices was one of its most enduring consequences. Elaine Pagels connects these buried stories to our present reality in a way that feels impossible to ignore. When we realize that women were pushed aside, not by divine decree, but by human choice, the weight of that distortion becomes clear. The Church's claim that women could not lead, preach, or hold authority was not the voice of heaven. It was the voice of men shaping a system to preserve their control. Doesn't that change the way we see centuries of tradition? When we understand it was built on silencing half of humanity? Pagels often pointed to the fact that the recovery of these texts is not just about history, it is about reclaiming what was lost. For modern readers, the Gospel of Mary or the hymns about Sophia open doors to a spirituality that honors both masculine and feminine, that allows women to speak with authority without apology. In a world where many still struggle for equality in faith communities, these revelations are not dusty relics. They are weapons of hope. Have you ever wondered whether your faith could feel more whole if it embraced both sides of the divine, rather than insisting on only one? At the same time, Pagels warned against oversimplifying. These texts do not offer a utopia. They show a struggle. Just as Peter resisted Mary in the apocryphal gospel, many men resisted women's leadership in real communities. The suppression of women was not smooth or inevitable. It was contested, debated, fought over, and that should inspire us today. If women resisted then, even as they were silenced, can we not also resist now when these truths return to light? This is where the past meets the present. Every time we read these suppressed writings, every time we speak Mary Magdalene's name as teacher rather than sinner, we undo a little of the distortion. Pagels invites us to see this recovery as part of a larger awakening, one that continues to challenge systems of power. For if history was once written to bury women's voices, then perhaps today it can be rewritten to bring them back into the light. The climax of Elaine Pagels' exploration comes when she shows how these forgotten truths create a sense of forbidden discovery. The very idea that women once held authority equal to men in Christian communities feels almost revolutionary today. Imagine the shock of early believers who heard Mary Magdalene speak with authority, or who prayed to a God envisioned not only as Father, but also as Mother. These ideas were so threatening to the emerging church that they had to be buried. Doesn't it feel as if you are peeking into a secret vault, uncovering what was never meant for your eyes? Pagels explained that this sense of uncovering a forbidden truth is part of why the Gnostic writings feel so powerful even now. They speak directly to the soul, bypassing rigid systems of doctrine. When the thunder, perfect mind proclaims, "I am the bride and the bridegroom," the text dissolves boundaries, embracing contradictions and unity. When the Gospel of Mary shows a woman teaching men, it dismantles the lie that authority must be male. These words carry the force of revelation, as if the ancient voices themselves reached through time to say, the truth was always bigger than what you were told. For centuries, the Church declared such writings heresy, yet the very act of suppression reveals their danger to established power. If women were acknowledged as bearers of divine wisdom, the hierarchy would collapse. If every believer carried equal authority, the system of bishops and priests could not dominate. The forbidden knowledge was not dangerous because it was false. It was dangerous because it was liberating. And here lies the reflective climax. The exclusion of women from power was not an accident of history, but a choice rooted in fear. Fear that equality would shatter control. Fear that the divine feminine would expose the imbalance. Fear that faith without hierarchy would empower too many voices. Once you see this, can you ever accept the official story as complete again? Elaine Pagels urged us to see that these ancient revelations are not just history, they are mirrors held up to our own time. The same dynamics that silenced women centuries ago often still linger in religious institutions today. When churches argue against women leading congregations, when spiritual authority is monopolized by men, aren't we hearing echoes of the same fear that once erased Mary Magdalene and Sophia from the sacred story? The question becomes, how much of what we call tradition is really just the continuation of old distortions? Pagels explained that Gnostic communities believed the divine spark lived in everyone equally, regardless of gender. This was not simply a metaphor. It shaped how they organized their communities. Women baptized, taught, and even led gatherings. Their authority flowed from the belief that wisdom comes directly from God, not through a human hierarchy. Compare that with the world we live in, where women are often told to wait their turn or remain silent in matters of faith. Doesn't this show how the suppression of women's authority is not divine order, but human control masquerading as holiness? At the same time, Pagels made clear that recovering these lost texts is not about replacing one domination with another. It is about restoring balance. The divine feminine was never meant to erase the masculine, but to stand alongside it. Together, they form the fullness of God, a wholeness that the official canon only partially reflects. When this balance is restored, faith itself becomes more complete. Isn't that what so many people still long for today? A spirituality that honors the wholeness of the human experience? This is why the rediscovery of the Nag Hammadi texts feels so urgent. They do not just tell us what the early Christians believed. They reveal what was intentionally hidden. They remind us that what we call Orthodox Christianity was only one of many paths, chosen not because it was the most true, but because it was the most useful to power. The other voices were not lost by chance. They were buried. And now that they rise again, we are faced with a choice. Will we ignore them, or will we finally listen? Elaine Pagels shows that when we let these buried voices speak again, they bring us to a moment of revelation that feels almost dangerous. To admit that women once held authority in Christianity, and that this authority was erased, is to confess that history itself has been manipulated. It is to see that what we call truth has often been filtered, reshaped, and controlled by those in power. Doesn't that realization stir something inside you? A mix of anger and wonder, as if you are uncovering a secret that was never meant to be revealed? The Gnostic texts do more than challenge history. They ignite reflection on our own lives. If every soul carries the spark of the divine, then no institution has the right to declare who is worthy of speaking or leading. Authority comes from the light within, not from the approval of earthly rulers. Imagine how different our world would look if this principle had been the foundation of Christian faith. Would we still struggle with inequality? Would women still have to fight to be heard in pulpits, seminaries, and councils? Pagels insists that the rediscovery of these texts is not an academic curiosity, but a spiritual challenge. They ask us whether we are willing to question what we have inherited. They confront us with a choice: to remain in the version of faith shaped by silence, or to embrace a fuller vision where both women and men reflect the divine. And isn't it striking that the more we uncover of the past, the more it speaks to the battles still being fought today? This is the reflective climax. The church did not silence women because God willed it, but because men feared it. And if that fear shaped centuries of belief, then recovering these lost voices is not just about history, it is about liberation. For once you know the truth, you cannot return to ignorance. Once you hear Mary's voice again, can you accept a Christianity without her? So, what do these revelations truly mean? Elaine Pagels showed us that the exclusion of women from Christian power was not the natural order of God, but the strategy of men shaping history to preserve their control. The buried Gospels, the hidden hymns, the silenced voices of Mary Magdalene and Sophia, all remind us that another Christianity was possible. Faith where authority was shared, where the divine spark was seen equally in women and men, and where the fullness of God embraced both the masculine and the feminine. Doesn't this awaken a sense of loss, but also of possibility, as if the story of faith is still unfinished and waiting to be reclaimed? When we recover these hidden truths, we join a chain of seekers stretching back to those early communities who dared to defy the system. By listening to what was silenced, we give life again to what rulers tried to erase. And this act is not only about the past, it is about the present. It means giving space to voices that were denied, creating faith communities that honor the balance of creation, and resisting any system that thrives on silence. If you believe these revelations matter, let your voice be heard. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts, because every word restores a piece of the story that was buried. Like this video if you feel that forgotten truths deserve to rise again, and subscribe to this channel so you can walk with us as we uncover more mysteries hidden for centuries. By doing so, you help keep alive the memory of those voices that once shook the foundations of power. And remember, the search does not end here. What other truths still lie hidden beneath the surface of tradition? What other voices still wait to be heard? The journey of discovery continues, and perhaps the next revelation is already whispering to your soul.